And so the reason for that is because the threats continue to move up, and they just are on such a larger scale that it's becoming much more common to have it as an everyday lingo that more people can understand. And because of that, there's much more focus on the defenders to actually make sure they're implementing their security practices so they don't become the next headline that's going to happen on the news.
Yes, I guess it's a combination of some of the technical people going into leadership roles, but also leaders actually just existing in an environment where more is known, more is discussed, there's more weight given to the subject, so they're like, okay, I need to know what I'm doing here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that contributes to a lot of it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So, look, you said you think it'll take 10 years to do a move towards a more sort of zero trust, a true zero trust style architecture in Fed Gov. I think that's about right, but I also...
Welcome back to the Stronger by Science Fireside Chat series. I am your host, Greg Knuckles, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Eric Drexler. Eric, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
You know what? Honestly, not doing my best today. Just putting it out there for the listeners, but it is what it is, and gonna soldier through anyways.
Well, we appreciate it.
So, as I mentioned on the last episode, it was somewhat up in the air about whether this would be the last fireside chat before, more science-y and content-heavy episodes came out, or whether this would be the first science-y, content-heavy episode back. Anyway, ring the bell, etc., so you can get notifications for when that's scheduled and when it goes live.
Sound good?
Cool. All right, yeah, let's hop into it with questions. So from the Facebook group, Andrea Farmer asks, what are some things that seem difficult to cook or bake, but is actually pretty easy and worth trying? So as the cook here on the Stronger by Science Fireside Chats, I figure you should lead it off.
Okay, cool. Yeah, at first I was getting a little defensive there. As our resident chef, I want to answer this a little bit differently. Obviously, anything that requires any skill or effort to cook, it's really not within my realm of expertise. I focus on doing stuff that is extremely easy to do, anyone any particular way of eating, but I noticed that when I switched to a vegetarian diet, my meal preparation did not get any more difficult at all. It actually got a tiny bit easier, if that's even possible. And my cost per meal actually went down. So I wanted to share a really, really easy dinner that I make that is like super easy, super cheap, and keeps me happy. So I've been eating this a lot lately, but what I do is I just get frozen vegetables, spread them on a baking sheet. I put aluminum foil on the sheet so that I don't have to wash it after. Put those in at like 350, get some edible, which is what you're going for. Get the rice cooker going with white rice, and they'll finish about 30 minutes later. Pop open a can of garbanzo beans, also known as chickpeas. Mix it all together, put on some teriyaki sauce, some soy sauce, and it's great. And the way I got to this meal was I basically started with like an elaborate tofu-based stir fry, and I just started eliminating all the things that were even remotely challenging or labor-intensive. And all of a sudden, you end up with a meal like this, and you're like, hey, it's great. And it's relatively low energy density. You can increase the energy density just by increasing the amount of rice that you're throwing in there. Easy to make, vegetarian, super cheap, and minimal cleanup, which is huge. Another thing we talked a little bit about in mass, and I think we mentioned on the podcast, food texture and how that can influence the rate of eating, satiety, things of that nature. Like I said, I used to make this with tofu, and then I got too lazy to cube the tofu, which is just, it's like 5 minutes, for God's sakes. Who has the time? So I said, I'm just going to open a can of beans and put it in. When I switched from tofu to the chickpeas, I noticed that the satiety that I was experiencing in the meal actually did appreciably increase. And I think the texture has helped
while you're learning how to make it and still have a very delicious product at the end. And it's also something that you can ease into if any of these things intimidate you. So especially if you're concerned about like being able to handle the dough well, if it's going to be too sticky. The thing about dough is that the stickiness is pretty proportional to how wet it is. So just start with drier doughs to begin with. And that's not going to give you like super airy bread with like large bubbles, like a rustic hearth loaf or whatever, but that's fine. Like you can start with something easier, and then as you just get more and more comfortable handling dough, you can work up to higher and higher hydration doughs. So it's something that if you did just jump straight into the deep end, it might be pretty challenging, but it's something where you can start with very easy breads and then just work to more and more challenging breads over time. So, you know, there is kind of that progression, and entry-level breads are quite easy to make. Something else that I think intimidates people is making caramel or caramel at home, however you pronounce it. And I think the thing that concerns folks the most is that as they're trying to caramelize their sugar, that it's going to crystallize on them and isn't going to make a nice smooth caramel. There are three things you can do to help with that. So ultimately, like sugar starting to crystallize has a lot to do with how much agitation occurs and just if there are intact sugar granules, because like it's a crystal, it's like a crystalline structure that sugar is. The way crystals work is basically if there is a seed crystal, like further crystals can just kind of propagate the caramel. It's generally because like you got your sugar mixture going, it's boiling and simmering along, whatever. Some of it splashes onto the walls of the pan, and then all of the water is driven off of this very sugary water droplet that went on the side of the pan, and now you have a little sugar crystal, and if other sugar comes in contact with it, it'll start crystallizing. Not good. So just by leaving the lid on, like water will still evaporate out, like there will be enough steam pressure inside the pot that the water will get driven off, but it keeps the humidity high enough within the pot itself that those droplets that splatter onto the side of the pot won't completely dry out and crystallize. Like it'll just flow back down into the rest of the mixture much more easily. So yeah, just add a little extra water to start with, keep the heat low, and until most of the water is gone and the sugar starts changing color, just leave the lid on the pot. And that's like 90% of it, and it makes it so much easier. And like I said, not completely foolproof, but nearly foolproof. And then the last one, like this does stretch the definition of pretty easy but worth trying. So this last one does still take some effort, but I put it on here because I think people find it unnecessarily intimidating. And that is croissants, which, no, I'm not even going to try to butter. Like, yeah, things are probably going to go awry. But like I've accidentally like ripped the dough when I was making croissants before. Like I turn it over like as I was rolling it and be like, oh no, there's butter smeared on my countertop. Like it's leaking out. It's not going to get a good puff. It's totally fine. I've got the butter too hard before, and like the sheet of butter itself cracked as I was attempting to roll it out, and I was like, oh no, it's going to be uneven, whatever. Still totally fine. Thing is, when you put that much butter in dough, you're not ever going to work all of it into the dough. There's still going to be enough layers that you get that puff and that crunch and that texture that you expect from croissants. It's going to taste like dough and butter, which is one, delicious, and two, exactly what croissants taste like. Essentially, like it is labor intensive and quite difficult to make perfect croissants, but you can screw croissants up to a nearly infinite degree, and like when you put them in the oven, you're like, oh no, this is terrible, this is a disaster. and then just magically they come out of the oven and they're great. So, you know, it is very hard to get perfectly, but it's also incredibly hard to screw up to like an unredeemable degree. So if puff pastry in general or laminated doughs intimidate you, they shouldn't. Like you will screw them up at like instant ramen. And this was all when I was very young. So I think I was always interested in cooking, but I don't want to say like my parents never cooked for me or anything like that. But there wasn't that much kind of like direct tutelage from my parents to me about how
They didn't throw you the apron and say, come on, stand next to the stove.
I mean, they did from time to time, but it was mostly like for desserts. Like if
Yeah.
you know if we were making like a box cake mix or something, you know, my mom would have my brother and I come into the kitchen and be like, oh, we need 2 eggs. Can you grab 2 eggs? Like, oh, we need to mix this for 5 minutes. Can you use the mixer or whatever? But you know, she wouldn't say like, ooh, we're going to you know, do a reverse sear on some steaks. So like, here's how you check the temperature of the pan. Like, here's how long you cook. Like, there wasn't too much of that.
Yeah.
But I did always think cooking was interesting, and I wanted to be good at it. And we always had a lot of instant ramen on hand, in part because it's just delicious, and in part because it's very cheap.
Back in the day, it was like 10 cents per packet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Marjan, the top ramen, you could sometimes get 20 for $1.
Whoa.
I mean, I don't know, like,
That's awesome.
you grew up in the big city, but out in the country where I live, you could get, when it went on sale, you could get ramen for 5 cents a pack. It was fun.
So, first of all, one time when I was like dreamer bulking in college, I wasn't paying attention, and you know, I was just like constantly eating. Like, you've done a dreamer bulk, right? Where you're just like, I'm going to eat as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, that was like the first 25 years of my life.
You just feel sick. You're not really paying attention when you're putting the meals together. You're like, oh, here we are eating again.
Mm-hmm.
So I made some spaghetti noodles, and I was at that time shopping at Costco. It's like I needed 1 million calories a day to try to gain, 4 pounds a day. This ridiculous bulk I was doing. So everything in my life was Kirkland brand, right? My ketchup, my mustard, my socks, my jeans, everything in my life was Kirkland brand. So I reached into the refrigerator, Kirkland brand, red stuff, got it. Thought it was the spaghetti sauce. It was the salsa.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, I was too broke. What could go wrong? But I'm really, really lazy. So I always get the frozen vegetables.
Oh yeah.
That are pre-washed, pre-chopped. They're sitting there in the freezer. When you need to use them, you get them out. And honestly, frozen vegetables are fantastic. They retain their nutrients really well. They're very convenient, very affordable, and you don't have to worry about spoilage.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure everyone has been in that situation where you're walking through the grocery store, and in your mind, you're the healthiest person you've ever met, right? And you're like, oh, I'm going to tear through this fresh produce almost instantly when I get home. And then 4 days later, it's still in the refrigerator. You're like, what am I going to do with 11 pounds of carrots?
Yeah.
So I like that it takes that pressure off of you. Just leave it in the freezer. It's there when you need it.
Yeah, you can still never consume vegetables, but you're not creating food waste in the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's still aspirational.
Right.
I own vegetables.
Yeah. If anything up to this point was at all appetizing to the listener, just get that out of your head, right?
Well, we went good food, bad smell. We're just kind of shifting to a different sense here. It's funny, I made my list and didn't really think about it too closely. And then I looked at it again today and I said, this is just my life at the age of 17. Which is really funny. So the first things I wrote down that came to mind, one was wrestling knee pads. And so a lot of lifters are going to be able to identify with that because it's like a wrestling knee pad is like a lifter's knee sleeves,
Mm-hmm.
but just times a million, right? Because we're talking about like sweating in them for like a full 2.5 hour practice where you would usually lose.
Muskier and muskier shoulder pads, you know, with a pair hanging one in every locker. And we had like between JV and varsity, we probably had 130 kids playing football.
Yeah.
So within an enclosed, pretty poorly ventilated space, you've got 6-month-old ripening shoulder pads.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
Was to just shower regularly. So I picked up that habit from wrestling, and yeah, the Axe body spray stuff you can get by in like gym class or like, you know, football maybe, even though that's a terrible idea. But with wrestling, it's like you're going to have harm done to you if you don't shower enough. Yeah.
So for me, probably the worst thing I've ever smelled is cat diarrhea, and it just got wedged in the back of the fridge. Completely forgot about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very rotten. It was like growing mold.
Oh god.
And the thing is, like I've had that situation occur before, but like temperature affects like gas dispersion in general. So like colder things just inherently don't have as strong a